Hello and welcome to this bonus episode of Claremont in Conversation. I'm Natalie Bongiolo. Firstly, from all the team, thank you all for your feedback. And it seems that many of you are particularly intrigued by a certain witness, the man described as the third wheel in Edward's first marriage. Joining me in the studio is Tim Clark and Alison Pham. Okay, are you able to flesh out some of the details of this fellow's evidence for listeners?
Yeah, well, we can try. It was certainly one of the talking points of the week from many different aspects. So to put it into context, Mr. Edwards married his first wife in about 1991, and they moved in together, obviously quite quickly. But then his first wife, and remember she was the very first witness in the trial, recounted how the relationship had been on the wane after Mr. Edwards brought a computer home, and he basically spent more time over the keyboard than he did with her. She used to work in a legal office, and through that work had met another man. They got talking and became friendly. It was actually because of he had a headache, migraine on one of the days, and she had given him some first aid and helped him out. They got chatting. He found out that she owned a horse, which Mr. Edwards had actually bought her. He had kids from a previous relationship, and she said, well, why didn't you bring them up and they can have a ride of the horse? And that's how it all started. Mm-hmm. Mr. Edwards' interest in the computer didn't wane, and Mr. Edwards' first wife interest in this man didn't wane. And they basically began an intimate relationship, and it became so intimate that she basically asked him, or suggested to him, that he could take the spare room in the Edwards' marital home, which is exactly what he did for $100 a week. And so that's how we got to the stage where, or the position where, Mr. Edwards and his first wife and her lover are all living under the same roof.
And did this affair continue while they were all living together?
Very much so.
He was the father. Was he the father of her child?
Well, yeah, I mean, that came a little bit later. And we've talked all the way along this trial about such intimate details about people's lives in such an impersonal setting. And even though this witness's evidence was being given from overseas via a video link,
he was quite uncomfortable.
It was uncomfortable listening at times. I think for Mr. Edwards as well, because having a look at some of his body language, I'm not sure whether he knew all the details. We certainly didn't, having heard the wife's account of what had happened, because
very raw personal details.
That was sanitized somewhat. If the third wheel's evidence was true, and he swore an oath to tell the truth. So whether she might have omitted quite a bit of detail going on the later account that we heard.
He was quite nervous about it. In fact, he said he thought she was playing a dangerous game, jumping into his bed while her husband's in the next room. He actually tried to extricate himself, and then of course we heard how things went down after that. But of course the prosecution is saying that these emotional domestic upsets have been the trigger for Bradley Edwards to then go out and randomly attack some young women. So she's got to bring out these details. While we heard the first account where it was all very ho-hum, easy come, easy go, it was a different story painted later, where we heard he wasn't so easygoing. He was quite upset about it, but that's from friends. So, because when we first heard these rather salacious details, it was all like who cares? We're moving on to the next one. Even his lover his acquaintance, or the woman he had an affair with who was older than him, she said, well, actually, he was the one that broke up, not me. So there was that little stuff. It was quite conflicting at times, but it was all, their entire sex lives were laid bare.
Very uncomfortable for everybody.
Yeah, and as Ali said, this wasn't just done for, salacious titillation. It's done for a specific reason, and the specific reason is the motive that the prosecution, or the motive theory that the prosecution has about emotional turmoil. So, and in particular, the relationship with this man basically led to the breakdown of the marriage eventually, after one particularly unfortunate incident where Mr. Edwards walked in on his wife and the man kissing in his room. That led to basically the breakup, him leaving the house. She followed him, and as Ali alluded to, she eventually got pregnant. And it's that news of her breaking that news of the pregnancy to Mr. Edwards. It was in the same week that Jean went missing.
And at what point was there confrontation between the two men who were involved in this love triangle?
Well, it wasn't really. Was it a confrontation? I mean, according to one, he says, he reacted, but then his wife said, no, he won't mind. It was.
Well, and that's if you put these two accounts of the first wife and the third wheel side by side, they were. In time, they were perfectly perpendicular, but in detail, they were completely poles apart. So there was the hug and kiss incident that it's been referred to in court. So that was the big moment, and Mr. Edwards apparently didn't react angrily on that occasion. The witness basically described it as, I was crying, he was crying, she was crying. It was very emotional, but it wasn't a bust up. It wasn't it didn't get angry. But what he did say was, after they had moved out and then moved in together, Mr. Edwards' first wife and her lover. There was one occasion where Mr. Edwards had rung up, or was it the other way around? I can't remember. There was a phone call anyway, and the lover and Mr. Edwards basically got on the phone to each other, and it was at that point that Mr. Edwards, sort of blatantly said, "You're having an affair with my missus. I'm not happy about it," and.
But he didn't want to move him up.
Well, yeah, it was
all very
strange. So after the hug and kiss, he said, "No, stay,"
yeah.
but he didn't want to. But then during this phone call, it was then that said, "Well, mate, I mean, it's been as plain as the nose on your face, or it should have been for months and months and months." And apparently, it was at that point that Mr. Edwards said, "Well, I'm going to kill you."
And were they the words?
"I'll kill you."
That's what he said. Yes, the same ones. Yeah.
And the lover basically said, "Well, you know where I live, you know where we're living.
Yeah.
Come round if you want
to."
And it was then pointed out quite pointedly by Mr. Jovich, Mr. Edwards' defence barrister, that he did. You say he made that threat? Yes. Did he come round to the house? No. Did he ever follow up on any of those threats? No. So, in the context that we're in, it could be quite a significant comment. But if you think in your own lives, if you were presented with that position, you might well utter those words as well.
He certainly wouldn't be the first man to say that.
No.
And were there any other emotional moments that the prosecution pointed to during this man's evidence?
Yeah, so it was around about the time that the marriage was basically breaking down. The first wife described how she, like a lot of sort of unhappy wives do, she went and stayed with her mum and dad way south of Perth. And it just so happened that coincided with the Australia Day long weekend, 1996, which we've heard so much about. And it was so on that weekend, Mr. Edwards is said to have gone down to see his wife at his in-laws' house, and basically out of the blue, she hadn't invited him. He hadn't told her she was coming. He hadn't told her he was coming, but he's turned up, and very civil, and that was a word that the first wife used a lot in her evidence. Civil. He turned up. They talked. He even stayed for dinner, and then it was on that evening after dinner that Mr. Edwards is said to have said to his first wife, "Would you want to come and see the fireworks with me in Mandurah, which is a place about sort of 40 minutes south of Perth?" She said, "No, I don't no, I don't think it's a good idea. I don't really want to. And he left, which on its own seems completely mundane. But in the whole context of the case, the prosecution says, well,
this is another incident.
Australia Day 1996, just after midnight, Sarah Spiers went missing. And so that's the first of the emotional pinpoints that the prosecution want to draw. The second one obviously being the pregnancy that we've just mentioned. And then the third one with Ciara they wanted to say is that when the relationship was completely over, and the first wife was then still living with her lover, they sold the house. They sold the marital home, and it was the signing of those documents and the apparent finality of the end of the marriage was once again pretty coincidentally, or not so coincidentally, according to the prosecution, was when Ms. Glennon went missing.
And so at what point did Edwards find out that his wife and her lover were having a baby? And why was that significant to the prosecution's case?
That was so. It was just after they'd moved out. So there was this hug and kiss incident where basically the lover described how they'd been chatting, and she'd shown him a photo of herself when she'd won a wet T-shirt competition in Bindoon, and they were chatting and bonding over that behind a closed door, and then. They were being physical with each other, just having a kiss, and in walks Mr. Edwards, and there was a sort of moment of silence, and then the third wheels described it as just saying "oops," and that's it. I've crossed the line. I've got to get out of here, and that was what he said. His immediate reaction was, "I've just got to get out of here." And then we got one of these little tantalising tidbits that we've had throughout the trial, where he goes to say something, the judge stops him, and the question's not asked, because in this case, he said, "I've got to get out of here. I feared for my life because I didn't want to be in the house knowing what Mr. Edwards had in his room."
And we never heard any more about that, did we? No.
Yes.
What did he have in his room? Computers? What did he have?
Question.
Yeah.
Well, the intimation was that it was something that could possibly do him harm, but we don't know what, and we'll never know what, probably, because, as we've discussed before, once a witness is done, and this one was a complicated witness to get into court because he's living a long way overseas. There was time differences and video links and whatever. So.
And though the prosecution is, although he's come over as a fairly calm, sort of reacting guy, the prosecution has brought in witnesses like saying he had a sleep disorder, psychological assessments where he has outlined some problems.
Yeah, well, and that's just another fascinating part of this case, that on the one hand you've got work colleagues of Mr. Edwards saying
Mr. Bland,
Brad never expressed his emotion.
No.
He was very, very hard-working, very civil, very polite, very quiet. We've had lovers and ex-girlfriends saying how he wooed them with roses and used to take them to Italian restaurants and was persistent and kind.
But never overstepped the line, never drank, never,
But then you've got a little bit of a
psychological
a fork in the road where they say, well, yeah, but he did drink a bit, and he had
sleep disorders.
So he was obviously a night owl. And then we've had 3 people now have said they feared for their lives in his presence. We've got the lover, we've got obviously the woman that he attacked at Hollingwood Hospital. She said, I honestly thought I was going to die. We've had the second wife who said, I feared for my life, because when I was scribbling down all these mysterious ATM withdrawals. And then obviously we've just on Friday we've had the hunting tale a victim who's described her own terror. So on the one hand we seem to have this hard-working, diligent, quiet, just common garden bloke just going about his business. And then on the other hand, we've got this completely
Quiet, yes.
completely different personality, where we know for a fact that he's attacked 3 women on their own, and
because he's just sat there for 2 weeks, looking like, as I said, just looking straight out, looking neither bored nor anything, just staring, just sitting there.
Yeah,
no expressions.
So that probably sums up most of what the man we call the third wheel, most of what he covered in court.
Interesting witness, important witness, I think.
His identity, of course, is suppressed,
it is.
as is that of the first wife, and of course the child that they had together.
Correct, yes. And he did reveal that himself and Mr. Edwards, his first wife, are also no longer together. That relationship ended sort of in the early 2000s. A very interesting, sort of memorable witness for a variety of reasons, but as we mentioned, also really quite pivotal to this whole emotional upset motive that the prosecution are going to keep pushing with until the judge makes his mind up one way or the other whether he's going to take it into account.
Well, thank you both so much for outlining that for us, and we hope that's given listeners a bit more of a thorough picture of this witness's account, which is obviously a very crucial period in the prosecution's case against Edwards. Thanks for listening. In the meantime, stay tuned for more bonus episodes, and we'll be back on Monday for week 3 of Claremont in Conversation.
This podcast was hosted by Natalie Bongiorlo, produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy, and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.